American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
This edition of Undoctrinated is brought to you by Matt Taibbi. And now, The Pentagon's Bottomless Money Pit by Matt Taibbi, read by your host, Tim Dryden. The Pentagon's Bottomless Money Pit by Matt Taibbi. This was in the Rollingstone Magazine, March 17th, 2019. When the Defense Department flunked its first ever fiscal review, one of our government's greatest mysteries was exposed. Where does the DoD's $700 billion annual budget go? A retired Air Force auditor, we'll call him Andy, tells a story about a thing that happened at Ogden Air Force Base, Utah. Sometime in early 2001, something went wrong with a base inventory order. Andy thinks it was a simple data entry error. Quote, "Someone ordered 5 of something," he says, "and it came out as an order for 999,000. He laughs. "It was probably just something the machine defaulted to. Type in an order for a part the wrong way, and it comes out all freaking 9s in every field," end quote. Nobody actually delivered a monster load of parts, but the faulty transaction, the paper trail for a phantom inventory adjustment never made, started moving through the Air Force's maze of internal accounting systems anyway. A junior-level logistics officer caught it before it went out of the house. Andy remembers the incident because, as a souvenir, he kept the June 28, 2001 email that circulated about it in the Air Force accounting world, in which the dollar value of the error was discussed. The Air Force, which had an $85 billion budget that year, nearly created in one stroke an accounting error more than a third the size of the U.S. GDP, which was just over $10 trillion in 2001. Nobody lost money. It was just a paper error, one that was caught. Quote, "Even the Air Force notices a $1 trillion error," Andy says with a laugh. "Now, if it had been $1 billion, it might have gone through," end quote. Years later, Andy watched as another massive accounting issue made its way into the military bureaucracy. The Air Force changed one of its financial reporting systems, and after the change, the service showed a negative number for inventory, everything from engine cores to landing gear, in transit. Freaked out because you can't have a negative number of things in transit, Air Force accountants went back and tried to reverse the mistake. In doing so, they somehow ended up adding more than $4 billion in value to the Air Force's overall spare parts inventory in a single month. This suspicious number is still there. You can see a sudden spike in the Air Force's working capital fund's stagnant spare parts numbers. It was $23.2 billion in 2015, $23.3 billion in 2016, $24.4 billion in 2017, and then suddenly $28.8 billion in September 2018. That doesn't mean money was lost or stolen. It does, however, mean the Air Force probably has less inventory on hand than it thinks it does. Now retired, Andy sometimes visits his neighborhood library, which uses RFID smart labels, or radio frequency identification, allowing it to know where all its books are at all times. Meanwhile, the Air Force, which has a $156 billion annual budget, still doesn't always use serial numbers. It has no idea how much of almost anything it has at any given time. Nuclear weapons are the exception, and it started electronically tagging those only after two extraordinary mistakes in 2006 and 2007. In the first, the Air Force accidentally loaded 6 nuclear weapons in a B-52 and flew them across the country, unbeknownst to the crew. In the other, the services sent nuclear nose cones by mistake to Taiwan, which had asked for helicopter batteries. Quote, "What kind of an organization," Andy asks, "doesn't keep track of $20 billion in inventory?" End quote. Despite being the taxpayer's greatest investment, more than $700 billion a year, the Department of Defense has remained an organizational black box throughout its history. It's repelled generations of unofficial inquiries, the latest being an audit 3 decades in the making, mainly by scrambling its accounting into such a mess that it may never be untangled. Ahead of misappropriation, fraud, theft, overruns, contracting, corruption, and other abuses that are almost certainly still going on, the Pentagon's first problem is its books. It's the world's largest producer of wrong numbers, an ingenious bureaucratic defense system that hides all the other rats' nests underneath. Meet the Gordian knot of legend, brought to life in modern America. At the tail end of last year, the Department of Defense finally completed an audit. At a cost of $400 million, some 1,200 auditors charged into the jungle of military finance, but returned in defeat. They were unable to pass the Pentagon or flunk it. They could only offer no opinion, explaining the military's empire of hundreds of acronymic accounting silos was too illogical to penetrate. The audit is the last piece in one of the great ass-covering projects ever undertaken, also known as the effort to give the United States government a clean bill of financial health. 29 years ago, in 1990, Congress ordered all government agencies to begin producing audited financial statements. Others complied. Defense refused from the jump. It took a Herculean legislative effort last 20 years to move the Pentagon off its intransigent starting position. In 2011, it finally agreed to be ready by 2017, which turned into 2018, when the Department of Defense finally complied with part of the law ordering, quote, timely performance reports, end quote. Last November 15th, when the WIFT audit was announced, Deputy Secretary of Defense Patrick Shanahan said it was nothing to worry about because, quote, we never expected to pass it, end quote. Asked by a reporter why taxpayers should keep giving the Pentagon roughly $700 billion a year if it can't even, quote, get their house in order and count ships right or buildings right, end quote, Shanahan quipped, quote, we count ships right, end quote. This was an inside joke. The joke was the Pentagon isn't so hot at counting buildings. Just a few years ago, in fact, it admitted to losing track of 478 structures, in addition to 39 Black Hawk helicopters, whose fully loaded versions list for about $21 million a pop. That didn't mean 478 buildings disappeared, but they did vanish from the government's ledgers at some point. The Pentagon bureaucracy is designed to spend money quickly and deploy troops and material to the field quickly, but it has no reliable method of recording transactions. It designs stealth drones and silent-running submarines, but still hasn't progressed to barcodes when it comes to tracking inventory. Some of its accounting programs are using the ancient computing language COBOL, which was cutting edge in 1959. Quote, these systems, as one Senate staffer put it, were not designed to be audited, end quote. If and when the defense review is ever completed, we're likely to find a pile of Enrons, with the military's losses and liabilities hidden in Enron-like special-purpose vehicles, assets systematically overvalued, monies Congress approved for feloniously diverted to Program Y, contractors paid twice, parts bought twice, repairs done unnecessarily and at great expense, and so on. Enron, at its core, was an accounting maze that systematically hid losses and overstated gains in order to keep investor money flowing in. The Pentagon is an exponentially larger financial bureaucracy whose mark is the taxpayer. Of course, less overtly a criminal scheme, the military still churns out Enron-sized losses regularly. And this is only possible because its accounting is a long-tolerated fraud. We've seen glimpses already. The infamous F-35 Joint Strike Fighter program is now projected to cost the taxpayer $1.5 trillion, roughly what we spent on the entire Iraq War. Overruns and fraud from the program alone are currently expected to cost taxpayers about 100 times what was spent on Obama's much ballyhooed Solyndra solar energy deal. Meanwhile, the Defense Department a few years ago found about $125 billion in administrative waste, a wart that by itself was just under twice the size of that $74 billion Enron bankruptcy. Inspectors found at least $6 billion to $8 billion in waste in the Iraq campaign, and said $15 billion of waste found in the Afghan theater was probably only a portion of the total loss. Even the military's top-line budget number is an Enron-esque accounting trick. Congress in 2011 passed the Budget Control Act, which caps the defense budget at roughly 54% of discretionary spending. Almost immediately, it began using so-called Overseas Contingency Operations, OCO, a giant second checking account that can be raised without limit. Therefore, for this year, the Pentagon has secured $617 billion in base budget money, which puts it in technical compliance with the budget control law, but it also receives $69 billion in OCO money, sometimes described as war funding, a euphemistic term for an open slush fund. non-defense spending also exceeds caps, but typically for real emergencies like hurricane relief. Add in the VA, $83 billion, Homeland Security, $46 billion, the National Nuclear Security Administration, $21.9 billion, and roughly $19 billion more in OCO funds for anti-ISIS operations that go to state and DHS. And the actual defense outlay is north of $855 billion. And that's just what we know about. Other programs like the CIA's drones are part of the secret black budget. In a supreme irony, the auditor's search for boondoggles has itself become a boondoggle. In the early 90s and 2000s, the Defense Department spent billions hiring private firms in preparation for last year. In many cases, those new outside accountants simply repeated recommendations that had already been raised and ignored by past government auditors like the Defense Inspector General. After last year's debacle, the services are now spending even more on outside advice to prepare for the next expected flop. The Air Force alone just awarded Deloitte up to $800 million to help the service with the future audit preparation. The Navy countered with a $980 million audit readiness contract spread across 4 companies: Deloitte, Booz Allen Hamilton, Accenture, and KPMG. Taxpayers, in other words, are paying gargantuan sums to private accounting firms to write reports about how previous recommendations were ignored. It's all a catch-22 story about a country trapped in an endless cycle of avoidable financial disaster. Each time we try to fix leaks, we end up back where we started, staring at even bigger numerical representations of failure. For instance, part of what inspired original investigations into defense finances were infamous stories in the 1980s and early 90s about the military charging $460 for toilet seats, $436 for hammers, etc. A chief crusader was a young Iowa Senator, Chuck Grassley, who was so determined to hear such tales from famed military whistleblower Frank C. Chuck Spinney, one of the first military analysts to go public with accusations of waste and procurement fraud, that early in 1983, Grassley drove to the Pentagon in an orange Chevette to see him. The DoD refused to let Grassley see Spinney. Grassley got him to testify on the Hill 6 weeks later. Quote, "The following Monday, his photo was on the cover of Time magazine," Grassley recalls. The March 1983 cover asked, "Are billions being wasted?" It seems like a breakthrough. Spinney's tales of waste became symbols that aroused the imagination of both the left and the right, who each saw them in their own vision of government run amok. But 35 years later, Chuck Grassley, now 85, is still sending letters to the Pentagon about overpriced parts, only this time with more zeros added. The Iowan last year asked why we were spending more than $10,000 apiece for 3D printed airborne toilet seat covers, or $56,000 on 25 reheatable drinking cups at a brisk $1,280 each. Apparently an upgrade to earlier iterations of $693 coffee cups, whose handles broke too easily. The DoD has since claimed to have fixed these problems. Asked if he was frustrated that it's the same stories decades later, Grassley says, absolutely, he pauses. Quote, "And a long time after I leave the Senate, it'll likely still be the same problem," end quote. 3 decades into the effort to pry open the Pentagon's books, it's not clear if we've been going somewhere or we've just been spending billions to get nowhere, in one of the most expensive jokes any nation has played on itself. Quote, "When everything's always a mystery," says Grassley, "nothing ever has to be solved." This started with an accident. Quote, "The only reason the audit is happening," says Sheila Weinberg, CEO of the watchdog group Truth in Accounting, "is because an accountant got sent to Congress," end quote. In 1985, a brusque Italian Albanian named Joe Diogardi ran as a Republican for a House seat in New York's 20th District. DioGuardi was the son of an immigrant grocer. Before he went on to a Jesuit education at Fordham, his schooling came in the aisles of his father's store. Quote, "I was trained in stock," DioGuardi says today. "You will learn value if you end up chasing someone down the street of the Bronx if they steal a box," end quote. In his teen years, he went on to be a waiter at Westchester country clubs. He'd watch chefs steal steaks out of the kitchen at the end of every year, knowing that, quote, "these rich people, if there was a deficit, they would just kick it in at the end of the year," end quote. From waiting tables, he went on to spend 22 years as an accountant at Arthur Andersen, among other things diving into New York City's financial collapse in the 70s. He recalls the city still listed buildings that had burned down as current assets. Quote, "I learned a lot about the difference between public and private accounting," end quote, he remembers. In the mid-'80s, he ran as a Republican for Congress in a Westchester district. It was considered a safe blue seat, with Democrats outnumbering Republicans. He calls himself, quote, "the accidental congressman," because, "if my party knew I would win, they wouldn't have put me up. I was a sacrificial lamb," end quote. But in a preview of cross-party populist currents, he did win, in part by highlighting his working-class ethnic background, trumpeting his accounting credentials, and sounding bipartisan themes about cleaning up corruption. He promised to, quote, "illuminate the dark fiscal corners," end quote, of the federal bureaucracy. In Washington, DioGuardi was horrified by the federal government's smoke and mirrors budgeting. He told fellow Republicans the techniques Congress used would get private sector officers sent to jail. Joey the waiter, who is 78 today, still has the same tough-talking New York personality he had as a candidate. It's easy to laugh imagining how his insistent Bronx demeanor was received by some of his more upper-crust and genteel colleagues back then. It would explain why he was first ignored when he began writing legislation to force the government to undergo the kind of auditing that's mandatory in the private sector. But when the savings and loan crisis plunged America into financial scare in the late 80s, fiscal responsibility became a political catchword. Instantly, Joey the waiter was in demand. Quote, "Suddenly everyone was like, 'Where's that bill DioGuardi wrote?' End quote, he recalls. He found diverse allies in a pair of Democrats, Senator John Glenn and Representative John Conyers. Together they authored what would ultimately be called Chief Financial Officers Act of 1990. The legislation forced government agencies to name a CFO, conduct audits, and create modern federal financial management structure. 23 agencies, from defense to labor to state, were ordered to begin submitting department-wide annual audit financial statements by 1994. Although there were regulations over the years requiring various forms of financial reporting, nothing like full-scale federal audit had ever been attempted. Incredibly, from an accounting perspective, the U.S. government had remained essentially virgin territory for centuries. As far back as 1787, the Constitution mandated a regular statement and account of the receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. But no independent examiner had ever fully checked the government's books. By the late 80s and early 90s, hundreds of billions of tax dollars were being spent annually, and no one really knew where. To DioGuardi, the situation was outrageous. Quote, "It's a constant principle in history, from the Medicis to today," says DioGuardi. "If no one's watching the money, there will be bankruptcies," end quote. The CFO Act at least introduced the idea that someone was supposed to be watching. By 1997, cabinet-level departments like Labor, Agriculture, and Commerce were submitting financial reports. In the first year, only 6 were able to pass. Within a few years, however, most were in compliance. By 2013, Defense was the only federal agency that had not submitted a financial statement. One of the main reasons the military wasn't submitting numbers was it didn't have them. The Pentagon every year employs an accounting shortcut that should make more sense to civilians at this time of year because it's similar to what the roughly 6% of Americans who cheat on taxes do annually. Taxpayers who think they're owed deductions but don't have the receipts to back up their expenses will sometimes take a rough guess, maybe based on what their prior year deductions were. Then they file returns infected with guesses, plugged in to look like deductions counted up honestly. The Pentagon does basically the same thing, only on a galactic scale. At the end of every year, it submits a budget execution request that includes complete month-by-month statements of that year's spending. The White House will then take these numbers and use them to project a defense budget for the following year. The President submits that budget to Congress, which in turn will actually appropriate the money. Almost without exception, the Pentagon ends up getting a raise. For 2019, Donald Trump submitted a budget that asked for $716 billion, for $82 billion more than the Department of Defense received the previous fiscal year. The system makes sense, except for one problem. The financial reports the Pentagon submits are faked. The Defense Department, for the most part, does not know how much it spends. It has handled on some things like military pay, but in other places it's clueless. None of its services, Navy, Air Force, Army, Marine Corps, use the same system to record transactions or monitor inventory. Each service has its own operations and management budget, its own payroll system, its own R&D budget, and so on. It's an empire of disconnected budgets, or fiefdoms, as one Senate staffer calls them. Instead of using a single integrated financial accounting system that would maintain a global picture of its finances at all times, the Pentagon built another bureaucracy to pile atop the others, called the Defense Finance and Accounting Service, or DFAS. Created by then Defense Secretary Dick Cheney in 1991, DFAS is in charge of collecting financial reports from all the different fiefdoms at the end of each month. DFAS is like a tribune traveling on a horseback at month's end, collecting a pile of scrolls from each castle. In 2013, Reuters published a brutal expose showing how DFAS accountants conducted a mad scramble at the end of each month to try to piece together records of transactions to justify spending. But in thousands of cases a month, no records existed. "We didn't have the detail," one accountant explained. Complicated matters is the fact that money is allocated to the military on different schedules. If Congress gives the Navy $53 billion for operations and maintenance, as it did this year, the service is expected to spend all that money that year. Such expenses, payroll is another, are called one-year money. Meanwhile, research and development might be 2-year money, and contracting might be 5-year money. If the Pentagon doesn't spend all the money in exactly the amounts Congress says it can spend in the time ordained by Congress, if it doesn't spend all its 1-year money in 1 year, all its 5-year money in 5 years, and so on, the military is supposed to give its unspent money back to Congress. But the military is never really on time and constantly commingles its various pots of money. Grassley in the late 90s found out the military was using a computer program called MOCAS, or Mechanization of Contract Administration Services, to help speed this commingling. Whenever the Pentagon had bills to pay, instead of just drawing the money from the right account, MOCAS would sometimes try to spend old money first, i.e. from whatever funds were about to expire. It's illegal for any government agency to spend money appropriated for one purpose on a different program, but the military, either hilariously or horribly, depending on your perspective, created a program that algorithmically produced such violations of the law. They weren't minor violations. Grassley has fought for years against such automatic payments, saying bureaucrats use them to avoid violations of the Anti-Deficiency Act, a felony. Last year's audit found the Anti-Deficiency Act was one of 5 laws the agency violated. MOCAS still exists, but it's unclear how or if it's been updated. In any case, defense still lacks records showing that it's paying for the right programs from the right accounts. Out of terror that it might have to return money as a result, the DoD orders its accountants to make numbers fit. Those DFAS accountants and the Reuters expose were told by superiors that if they couldn't find invoices or contracts to prove the various services spent their 1-year money and 2-year money and 5-year money on time, they should execute unsubstantiated change actions, i.e., lie. The accountants systematically plugged in fake numbers to match the payment schedules handed down by the Treasury. These fixes are called journal vouchers adjustments, or plugs. As a result, those year-end financial statements will look like they match congressional intention. In truth, the statements packed with thousands of plugs are fictions, a form of systematic accounting fraud Congress has quietly tolerated for decades. The fake number system is such long-accepted practice that it's acquired numerous dull-sounding names. You'll see the invented numbers called forced balanced entries by the General Accounting Office, which is run by Congress, adjustments not adequately supported by the Defense Inspector General, and journal vouchers, or JVs, or workarounds, by the Pentagon's own Comptroller General. On the Hill, everyone refers to plugs. There are innocent explanations for plugs, although even the best excuse is still incompetence. For example, if the Navy buys a helicopter from the Army, which is the item manager in charge of monitoring all rotary wing aircraft, it will show up as an expense on the books of both services. Although the money has been spent only once, both the Army and the Navy will report the expense. Instead of canceling out such intramural accounting discrepancies, which is what would happen at any chain of donut shops, the Department of Defense never bothered to fix its accounting rules. With hundreds of different acronymic systems, a single error might generate bogus numbers exceeding the transaction's original value. This is a generous example for news of the sort released by the Inspector General in 2016, showing the Army, with an annual budget of $122 billion, generated accounting plugs 54 times that amount, a full $6.5 trillion worth in 2015 alone. When civilian analysts see these numbers, they always first assume they're typos because no company could survive such gargantuan accounting snafus. Quote, "When I saw that $6.5 trillion number for the first time, I thought it had to be a mistake," says Michigan State University professor Mark Skidmore, who in 2017 led a study that discovered $21 trillion in plugs over a 17-year period. "I thought it was maybe $6 billion, but it's really $6 trillion, end quote. As these stories leaked out to the public, the huge numbers became mostly misunderstood talking points on social media. New Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for instance, cited Skidmore's study and tweeted that 2/3 of a $32 trillion proposed price tag for Medicare for All could have been funded already by the Pentagon. Ocasio-Cortez didn't have it quite right. Skidmore's $21 trillion figure doesn't mean that the money was wasted or is sitting in a Swiss account somewhere. The Pentagon didn't even receive that much money during the time period in question. Moreover, some of the plugs are adjustments upward and some downward. If they were ever netted out, no one has ever tried, the size of the accounting hole might be smaller. However, according to Andy and others, the $21 trillion figure may undercount the accounting errors in the system, as some plugs are both automated and unidentified. What's clear is that the ubiquitous plugging and quantity of bad numbers in the Pentagon's books are so massive that it will take a labor of the ages to untangle. All of this is difficult to follow, but the key is that when a suspicious number pops up anywhere in the military's multiple accounting silos, it typically isn't investigated, but simply fixed on paper and sent on its way. In a private company, if inventory numbers suddenly jumped by a few $1 billion in 1 month, auditors would swarm warehouses in search of the problem. The military can't say the same. This was one of the things auditors found last year, that the Pentagon lacked, quote, policies and procedures to confirm the existence of government property in possession of contractors, end quote. This is a fancy way of saying the Pentagon doesn't send inspectors to make sure Lockheed Martin or Boeing or whoever still have parts that they say they've repairing or maintaining. This ultimately is the conclusion of the audit. We don't have anything like a full picture of what waste and abuse might be hidden under those plugs, though we have an idea. See sidebar. We do, however, know the Pentagon's books are so choked with bad data that discovering abuses in real time is virtually impossible. Compound that with decades of cuts to the Pentagon staff of criminal investigators, and you have an open invitation to crime. Invoices could be systematically inflated for decades and no one would know. As Andy, the Air Force accountant, puts it, the system is, quote, desensitized to fraud, end quote. If you ask congressional staffers why the plugging system is permitted, they just shrug. Congress really has only two ways to respond when the DoD breaks the law. Elected officials can shout and criticize the Pentagon or withhold funds. The former is not terribly effective, and the latter has so far proved politically impossible. Quote, no other federal agency could get away with this, end quote, is how one Senate staffer puts it. The military has been told repeatedly to stop plugging and develop more rational accounting systems. In case after case, reforms compounded the problem. One of the first fixes was aimed at the infamous toilet seats and hammers. The General Accounting Office in 1992 issued a report blasting the military for, quote, poor cost estimating, end quote, and suggested changes. The result was the invention of a creature called the, quote, prime vendor, end quote. Basically a middleman with the power to set prices and choose subcontractors. This system only inflated prices. By 2004, Defense was spending $7.4 billion annually on prime vendor purchases after spending $2.3 billion in 2002. Knight Ridder newspapers got wind of this and in 2005 reported the military was now buying 85-cent ice trays from the prime vendors for $20 apiece. Within a month, a refrigerator for a C-5 airplane was being dragged on the floor of the House hearing, and a Navy admiral named Keith Lippert was being asked by California's Duncan Hunter to explain why he bought 9 fridges from a prime vendor for $32,642. Over the years, this pattern repeated itself. An attempt to standardize the military's payroll and personnel record systems, called DIMHRS, took 12 years and cost more than $1 billion before being scrapped. In 2005, the Air Force set out to buy a standardized computer system from Oracle called the Expeditionary Combat Support System. It took 7 years and more than $1 billion for that plan to be scrapped. John McCain joked about ECSS, quote, at least they got the toilet seat. Out of this, they got nothing, end quote. This same motif held with regard to the military's promises about, quote, audit readiness, end quote. The Pentagon initially said it would be ready to be audited by 1997. After that date passed with a yawn, Pentagon officials made a series of bold promises. In 2003, Defense Comptroller Dov Zakheim told the House Budget Committee, quote, we anticipate having a clean audit by 2007. Soon after disavowing that promise, he said, the further we dug, the more difficulties turned up, end quote. In 2005, the Pentagon began supplementing its verbal promises with reports called the Financial Improvement and Audit Readiness FIAR plan. This report basically told you every year that we were getting close to sorting all this stuff out. Some excerpts. December 2005. Progress has been achieved. September 2006. Progress has been made. September 2007. Progress has been made in several areas. March 2008. Substantial progress has been made. March 2009. Significant progress has been made, but much needs to be done. The Pentagon had been attempting to conduct department-wide audits dating back to 1996. By the mid-2000s, perhaps 100 auditors from the DoD Inspector General, plus 100 more from various services, were annually trying to create a single financial statement, despite an almost complete lack of audit trail information. They made some helpful recommendations, but would never get very far before concluding an audit was not possible. Quote, "We were trying to make chicken soup out of chicken shit," end quote, says an auditor with a sad laugh. After nearly 15 years of such exercises, Grassley grew so furious that he introduced an amendment ordering the Pentagon to stop trying to audit itself until it was capable of doing something useful. The amendment passed and lived on as Section 1003 of the 2010 National Defense Authorization Act. The 2010 NDAA amendment also ordered the Pentagon to actually be ready by 2017. Quote, "It was start over and get it done," end quote, says Grassley now. The Grassley Amendment stopped the annual mobilization of hundreds of auditors, but didn't stop the audits completely. The two competing laws, the CFO Act and the 2010 NDAA, created a literal catch-22, with the services both ordered and not ordered by law to complete the audits of themselves. The services tried to spend their way out of the problem. Incredibly, they began competing to see how much they could blow on audit readiness programs. In 1997, the Army splurged at least $4 billion on the Global Combat Support System, which the Center for Public Integrity said was designed to centralize a dozen different outmoded accounting systems. The smaller Marine Corps developed its own system with the same name and dropped $1 billion. The GAO, in 2009, then issued a report complaining $6 billion had already been spent in audit preparation. According to the GAO, it took that much money to get the Pentagon to a place where it could accurately track incoming appropriations. In 2011, then Defense Comptroller Robert Hale confessed to Congress, quote, "We don't really fully understand in the Department of Defense what you have to do to pass an audit for military service, because we have never done it," end quote. Translation: despite having 60,000 financial management employees who'd had 21 years to wrap their heads around the task of producing financial statements, Hale admitted none had taken the plunge. Quote, "You can't learn to swim on the beach," end quote. Speaking of beaches, Hale said he hoped to use the Marine Corps as an accounting beachhead because it was ahead of the other services in terms of auditability. But a 2011 trial audit of the Marines ended in catastrophe. The Inspector General found it couldn't account for $2 billion in expenditures. It sounds worse when you consider they were only auditing a $4 billion portion of the Marines' budget. The Marines doubled down. In 2014, the Pentagon announced the Corps passed an audit for 2012. The event was so momentous, they marked the occasion in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes. Then Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel was presented with a framed certification of the clean opinion. Hagel, a consistent ally of defense, beamed as he said, quote, "We don't spend a lot of time using big megaphones to tout our great accomplishments. We get the job done," end quote. But word began to spread that the Marine audit was again a con job. Quote, "It was an intellectual exercise in cheating and deception," end quote, says Grassley, whose office was in the middle of effort to get the Inspector General's office to re-examine the results. Within a year, the Inspector General withdrew its approval. Quote, "Our opinion on the FY 2012 United States Marine Corps," it said, "is not to be relied upon," end quote. Even worse, it then came out that the Inspector General's office was sending emails down the chain, pressuring auditors to agree with an outside auditing firm, which already had a record of flawed audits in the Marine Corps. This should have been a red flag, according to retired military auditor Jack Armstrong. Quote, "Why wouldn't you want to train a very close eye when you've already had suspicions about the quality of their work?" End quote, says Armstrong. Then Defense Department Comptroller Mike McCord was philosophical about the Marine fiasco. Quote, "It's a learning experience," end quote, he said. After all of these false starts, it soon became clear that the only way to get the Pentagon to actually fix itself would be if Congress stopped sending money. Starting in 2012, a succession of legislators in both the House and Senate, including Tom Coburn, Republican, Oklahoma, Barbara Lee, Democrat, California, Ron Wyden, Democrat, Oregon, Rand Paul, Republican, Kentucky, Bernie Sanders, Independent, Vermont, and John McCain, Republican, in Arizona, tried to introduce amendments yanking funding if the Pentagon didn't correct itself. Quote, "None have made it into law," end quote, says Mandy Smithberger of the Project on Government Oversight. A major problem is campaign finance reform. Ask Hill staffers why it's hard to pass any bill that even contemplates withholding funding for the Pentagon, and they say you'll run smack into a bipartisan batch of refuse-nicks who've been gorging on defense sector campaign contributions thanks to their status on committees like Armed Services or Appropriations. Quote, "You can't get the Pentagon to take an auditing seriously unless you threaten to stop funding, and you can't stop funding without campaign finance reform," end quote, says one Hill staffer. Unfortunately, the annual audit has now created a secondary cash flow for the accounting firms, which have formally entered the family of permanent high-end military contractors like Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, Boeing, and Raytheon. The money now flows out in two directions. One estimate puts the annual cost for accounting at about $1.4 billion a year for the audits by firms like Ernst & Young, and about $600 million for firms like Deloitte to fix problems identified by said audits. The Pentagon can keep accountants busy forever simply by doing a taxonomic job of describing its inauditability. The Defense Department employs 3 million people, has 280 ships, nearly 16,000 planes, and 585,000 facilities in at least 80 countries. You've heard of too big to fail. The DoD's universe is too big to count. Quote, "Impossible. We can't do it. It's too big," end quote, one exasperated DoD official complained. Quote, "They're telling us it's going to get worse before it gets better," end quote, is how one Hill staffer puts it. If auditors ultimately make sense of all their work, it's worth it. But they could easily just keep inching toward compliance forever. Quote, "For $1 billion a year," says Grassley, "you ought to see progress," end quote. In April 2016, U.S. Comptroller General Gene Dodaro testified before the Senate that the Pentagon had spent up to $10 billion to modernize its accounting systems. Those attempts, he said, had, quote, "not yielded positive results," end quote. 2 years later, Senators Grassley and Sanders, along with Wyden and others, were asking Dodaro in a letter why no progress had been made towards getting those systems in place. Quote, "Are you going to finish it in my lifetime?" end quote, a Hill staffer is said to have demanded in a meeting with Dodaro. He got no answer. Sanders last year introduced an amendment to ding the Pentagon for 0.5% of its funding until it passes, not takes, but passes an audit. He failed, but is going to keep trying. For his office, the Pentagon audit issue is as much about misplaced social priorities as it is about waste and mismanagement. Quote, "Over and over again, We've been told we cannot afford to guarantee health care as a right, make public colleges tuition free, or seriously address any of the needs of the working class, Sanders says. When it comes to the massive waste, fraud, and abuse at the Pentagon, there's a deafening silence, end quote. Both Sanders and Grassley have been tilting at the Pentagon windmill for decades now, from opposite ends of the political spectrum. For Grassley, there is a sense of exhaustion. Asked how much progress has been made towards creating a workable accounting system at the Pentagon, he says, quote, "At my level, I would have to say 0, he pauses. Based on the track record, it seems like they don't want to fix it, end quote. All this history sums up the conundrum. A Republican waste hawk like Grassley laments the unwillingness of the Pentagon to implement a modern, corporate-style, unified accounting system, and is convinced there will never be a clean audit until one is developed. Meanwhile, the progressives like Sanders, who is anxious to dial back Pentagon spending as part of a general rethink of our national priorities, laments the unwillingness of Congress to take the real steps needed to enforce compliance. The system of campaign contributions that keeps key committees captive probably locks this problem in place until there is reform on that end. Both senators, unfortunately, have legitimate concerns. The twin obstacles to a true audit, one logistical, one political, are reasons few on the Hill feel confident a clean opinion is coming anytime soon. As one Hill staffer puts it, quote, "DOD loves to find inefficiencies. It just means more they can spend," end quote. He adds, quote, "Every year you know they're going to get that $700 billion. That's not going to change," end quote. Until someone passes a law with real teeth that really threatens cuts of military appropriations, the most likely eventuality is the Department of Defense continuing to take and flunk audits at great expense in perpetuity. At best, each year we may end up getting a conclusion like this one about the 2018 audit from the Pentagon's Inspector General. Quote, "The most important outcome was not the overall opinion," the IG wrote, "but that the Department of Defense makes progress," end quote. It's impossible to overstate the enormity of the problem the Department of Defense stalled audit poses. The fact that it can't pass audits mean the entire government is in the same boat. Until the Pentagon gets a passing grade, the whole United States will annually receive what's called a disclaimer of opinion on its finances, which is accounting S for incomplete. DioGuardi, who set all this in motion 30 years ago, says no publicly traded company could issue a bond without passing an audit first. But the U.S. issues hundreds of billions in bonds, despite the gaping hole in its books caused by the endless, unresolved problem at the Department of Defense. Quote, "From an accounting point of view," he says, "it's a horror story," end quote. Quote, "Ernst & Young will eat them alive," says Andy. "It's so much worse than people think," end quote. Just over 50 years ago, Dwight Eisenhower gave his famous farewell address warning of the power of the military-industrial complex. The former war commander bemoaned the creation of, quote, "permanent armaments industries of vast proportions," and said the potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist, end quote. Eisenhower's warning is celebrated by the left as a caution against the overweening political power of war makers, but as we're now seeing, it was predictive also as a fiscal conservative's nightmare vision of the future. The military has become an unstoppable mechanism for hoovering up taxpayer dollars and deploying them in the most inefficient manner possible. Schools crumble, hospitals and obstetric centers close all over the country, but the armed services are filling warehouses for some programs with, quote, 1,000 years worth of inventory, end quote, as one Navy logistics officer recently put it. It's the ultimate example of the immutability of the American political system. Even when there's broad bipartisan consensus and laws passed, and both money allocated for changes and agencies created to enact them, if the problem is big enough, time bends towards corruption, and chaos always outlasts reform. Eisenhower couldn't have predicted how right he was.
Are we so alone, so distant, so forgotten, as we think ourselves to be? These are our lives, but did they ever even matter? Are we worth remembering? These machines feed on the tears of broken lives and dying dreams. We're throwing wrenches in the gears. Our lives will not be lived in vain. When this is all said and done, we spent this life on the run, judged by the common. Just we keep our language buried inside these lungs that keep us alive. We breathe so selfishly. Promises we plan to break are made in whispered voices, 'cause our despair knows many names. We make mistakes, but we apologize with roses. We never stop to smell on the way. These machines feed on the tears of broken lives and dying dreams.
All right. Thank you to Matt Taibbi for writing that great piece about how fucked the Pentagon's financial situation is. You know what? I bet if we throw more money at that problem, it'll all work out.
Yeah, that's a safe bet.
That's all.
That's always worked.
They just don't have enough money. That's the problem.
Yeah.
Anyway, I thought that would be a good episode to throw up here. You know, some of our episodes are like maybe 10% undoctrinating. This one, shit, I'm going to go with 90%.
Yeah, if this doesn't change your mind about things, then what will?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple other episodes we did that are very undoctrinating, if you will. And this one's right up there. So it's all part of the process. There's a lot of articles I read to myself and not always into the microphone. This one I felt was extremely fascinating. I knew I was going to be reading this one about 10 paragraphs in on the podcast. But
Glad you did.
yeah. Continue to watch our Twitter feed. I'm going to be posting other articles on there that aren't necessarily going to make it onto the podcast that everybody should read. Matt Taibbi is a great journalist. One of the few journalists out there that has the right idea and actually engages in true journalism.
Yeah, that's hard to come by these days.
Yeah, you don't get that on TV. You really have to go to some obscure magazine or website or podcast to get it. Let's see, what else happened in the news recently? Oh, that's right. Mueller submitted his report on Russiagate.
Dun dun dun. Well, it pretty much turned out the way we said, so.
Yeah, I mean,
There was no damn collusion.
Overall, it seems like a big waste of time. I mean, not in the sense that there was a lot of people out there worried that the president was actually conspiring with the Russian government. So I guess you get some peace of mind for those people at least. Although some of them seem to be upset by the results of this thing.
Because
I don't
they
quite understand
wanted
that.
collusion.
Yeah, I
Doesn't
think
make any sense.
Bill Maher
Weird people.
said he was disturbed at the results or something like that.
Doesn't
This
make any
fucking
sense.
guy, I mean, just moved to Canada already.
Yeah. I know, that's what I don't understand. If people are so upset about it, there's other options.
Well, when you're Bill Maher, you're just upset that you basically sounded like a dipshit the last 2 years. And Rachel
That's probably why
Maddow
he's
and
disturbed.
Chris Hayes and all these other idiot talking heads on, the majority
Well,
of
that's what
TV
happens when
news.
you go and blab your mouth before you don't even know what
Before
the fuck
you
is
gather
going
the
on.
facts.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's just what happens. You can come out looking like an ass when you assume things.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. A lot of people trusting what the
They're probably just going to say that Trump paid the FBI to lie.
well, I mean, that's the thing. Like all these people they basically bowed down to whatever the intelligence agencies said this whole time. So it's going to be hard for them to turn their back on that.
It's
you
too
can't,
late for that now.
Yeah, you just basically placed all your trust in the FBI, and you can't really turn your back on
That
them
was their
now.
first mistake. No.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's what they do. The FBI isn't going to tell you the truth. So whenever you hear a report from intelligence agencies or State Department or, I don't know, unnamed sources, anonymous sources, remain skeptical. That's for sure.
Yeah.
That's the least you can do. But yeah, the report is in. Nobody's seen it yet, except the Attorney General. He came back with a 4-page report and basically stated that Mueller didn't find any conspiracy, collusion, any crimes related to conspiracy with the Russian government. Trump is basically in the clear now.
Gonna get elected again for another couple of years.
Yeah, so people are gonna turn their attention to Russia, unfortunately. Still, they're not gonna let it go. They're gonna turn their attention mainly to their claims that Russia interfered in the election.
Yeah,
some of them
hacked the social media accounts.
Some of them have doubled down on saying that we've been attacked by the Russians. That's some dangerous rhetoric right there. But I don't know. I'm thinking about doing an episode on it. I haven't decided who I want to get on as guest yet. If you're listening to this and you want to come on and talk about it, let me know. And we've got some other cool shit lined up outside of that. Outside of politics. I've got a few interviews coming up that I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, those will be good.
Natalie's about to bring home the March Madness pool.
Dun, dun, dun. This will be my second time, people. And I know nothing about it. I make my picks in 30 seconds. I just go, eeny, meeny, miny, mo. There you go. Give me the money. Everybody else overthinks it, and they pick weird shit, and then their brackets fall to pieces.
You're talking into the back end of that microphone, by the way.
Did y'all hear that? I'm going to win.
Yeah, no, you're being picked up fine, but...
Is that better?
See where the logo is? That's the front. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, there you go.
Well.
Perfect.
That's right. 2 years.
Yeah, it's not set in stone yet, but it's looking pretty good for you.
I know. I
TJ's
really hope
pretty
I
much
win.
out. He picked North Carolina to win it all, and they lost a few hours ago.
It's the ones that think they know so much that really know so little.
Yeah. TJ was
Just
talking
kidding,
so
TJ. I'm
much
just
shit
kidding.
on my bracket earlier. I think in the last episode.
That's why we tried reaching out to him today, and he didn't even reply back.
Maybe.
Probably because my brackets is the best bracket.
Yeah, not only did his bracket get busted today, but yours is just on
Mine's
fire.
skyrocketing.
So. Speaking of that.
But yeah.
I'm checking the score of the Houston, Kentucky game.
Yeah. I'm still pregnant.
Yep.
That's also a thing.
No updates on that front.
No. A few more months to go, and you'll be hearing cries on the podcast.
Kentucky beat Houston, so you
Oh,
lost.
that's not good. That's
you
not
lost your first
good.
Final Four team.
Oh, no.
I think actually most people in the pool picked Houston to win that game.
Son of a bitch. Right
But,
when I talk shit, look what happens. That's what I
But
get.
you're all right. You're still fine. You've got Gonzaga and Virginia remaining, so
Well,
you'll
we'll
be
see
all
what
right.
happens. I'll probably lose, but I need the money. I need to win.
Let's see the updated standings. You're still in third, but I think you do have the best remaining bracket
As long as I beat TJ, I'm
with
happy.
three of
Just
your
kidding,
four,
TJ.
three of your final four still remaining. This guy
Am
has
I
lost
beating you?
2 of his final 4. What's up?
Am I beating you?
I'm in last.
Oh, this is great. I'm beating you and TJ.
Yeah, the 2 guys in front of you have less final 4 options remaining, so
Those 2 guys in front of me
I
cheated.
would say even though you're in third, you're favored to win this thing.
Wasn't there a way to bump me up so I can get paid sooner?
Well, a lot's going to be determined on Saturday and Sunday.
How about I just get paid now, and then if I lose, I'll just pay it back? How about that?
No.
Why?
I don't think that's how it works, Natalie.
Well, it should. It's like a loan for.
That's not how pools work. That's not how betting works.
It's a pool loan.
Next time I go to the sports book in Vegas, I'm going to say, you think I can just get a front on this payout and I'll just come back and pay you guys back if it loses?
Yeah, it's like a pool payout.
Knowing
pool
Vegas, they'd be like, yeah, sure, just go to the cashier's window. They'll give you money.
Yeah. Give us your thumbprint and a little splotch of blood and
Yeah.
hair sample, and you're good to go.
Fucking A. All right, let's wrap it up. This is going to be the last episode of the month, but hopefully we're going to get together maybe tomorrow or Sunday night and record another one. Like I said.
Can you believe we're a couple months away from halfway through this year already? That's crazy.
Yep.
Thank you to all of our followers on social media.
Yeah, you guys are great. I hope you made it over here and you're hearing us and you listen to this episode. And I hope most of all you like what you hear.
Tweet at us good ways to get rid of headaches.
Yeah, fucking tweet at us for sure. Even if it's not headache remedies, tweet at us any critiques you have of the episodes. We don't really want to hear your bullshit responses to articles and things that I retweet. But if you have some critiques of this episode, please.
Yeah.
That would be welcome. And if you can't put it in a tweet, email us. We are undoctrinatedpodcast@gmail.com.
Undoctrinated1 is our Twitter.
Yes, @undoctrinated1 is
Yeah.
the Twitter.
And Undoctrinated Podcast is our Instagram.
Yes, follow us on all formats. Subscribe on YouTube.
Yeah.
Subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, anywhere you're listening to podcasts. If you're listening to this right now and you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that button.
Was that the sound of me winning again?
No, that was an ESPN update.
Oh. All right.
Even if you thought you subscribed already, go and check it. You know, sometimes these fucking platforms will unsubscribe you automatically.
Yeah, can you believe that?
I know, just because we're right-wing extremists.
Yeah.
Just kidding about that. Seriously, listen to the rest of the episodes. You'll realize we're not that.
Yeah. We're our own. We walk to the beat of our own drum over here.
Yeah, we might be extreme, but we're not on either of the wings.
We're undoctrinated extreme.
That's right.
Definitely not on anybody's wings.
All right, stay tuned. We got a great month of April coming for everybody.
Yeah, we have some good surprises coming
on
up.
top of everything, we're going to Coachella, so we'll definitely be reporting, not live, but reporting from Coachella.
Maybe we should bring the recording equipment there to the Airbnb.
That's not a bad idea.
Yeah, and we could do like some sort of updates about how swollen my feet are and my
We could
bladder that doesn't
we could
hold urine
report
for
on
very long.
what the scene is like when you're pregnant and at Coachella.
Yeah, it's gonna be a lot different than before.
I would think so.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's wrap it up.
Poor me.
We'll see you guys in April.
Thank you, everybody.
Paranoia is in bloom. The PR transmissions will resume. I try to push, try to keep us all down.